the horror. Let's not forget that as the temples were destroyed, we lost hundreds of thousands of Jews. And Jewish anguish visited upon us century after century. All is laden heavily on this day. And as a rabbi who spends half my time in Pittsburgh, I want to begin this afternoon by remembering the 11 Kedoshim we lost on October 27th in Pittsburgh, and adding their names to the multitudes of Jews who suffered at levels that we cannot even begin to comprehend. All of them we remember this day. This day is about Jewish power. The loss of sovereignty was essentially the loss of Jewish power. And if we begin with the joy, what brings me joy is that we, the Jewish people, have re-entered history. That from a macro perspective, what 1948 and the years that have elapsed since means to us is that we have attained Jewish power once again. That we have the capacity not only for self-determination, but as a people to determine exactly what we want to do in the world and to actually bring it about. Something that wasn't true for 2,000 years, as we were forced to the margins of history and became a powerless people. So one of the greatest aspects of joy for me is exactly the bringing about of the inversion of what happened with the destruction of sovereignty, and that is the reestablishment of sovereignty, of the consequent power the Jews have not only in Eretz Israel, but I would argue that at least since 1967, and 67 is a different type of turning point, 48 was sovereignty, but 67 was truly power, but that power gave to the Jews of the diaspora, at least to the Jews of the United States, a sense that they could take their Judaism in whatever direction they wanted to take it. And that is an extraordinary joy and a turning point in Jewish history that is amazing to be part of. On the other side of the coin is exactly the same thing, Jewish power. So for the first time in 2,000 years, we have Jewish power again. The Talmud was written in a context of powerlessness. The Halacha was created in a context of powerlessness. How will we use Jewish power? Did we create sovereignty? Did we bring it about simply in order to have our own place and utilize that power in an inward-looking way? Or does Jewish power in some way have implications for a broader world vision that we want to bring about? And my greatest concern is that the opportunity that Jewish power and sovereignty now convey upon us, and have conveyed upon us for the last number of decades, that opportunity will ultimately not be used in the way that our tradition envisages. And by saying that, what I mean is our tradition envisaged that we would use Jewish power, to my understanding, for moral purposes in the broader world, not simply to create an island unto ourselves where we look inward. So the greatest challenge and concern that I have right now is, will we be able to use the power that is now historically conveyed to us for purposes that will ultimately uphold and strengthen the very foundations of the Jewish tradition itself?
Tisha B'Av used to be such an easy holiday. Year after year, with all this torture, with all this suffering in the Galut, we would just add on yet another trauma, yet another reason to fast. I love the fact that Tisha B'Av has become so hard for so many of us, especially living here in Jerusalem. And there are articles in the Jerusalem Post and elsewhere saying, what are we doing? What kind of bananas are we? What kind of nutcases are we sitting here and fasting and beating our chest and beating our breast and going, what's going on? We're in mourning when we have this miracle around us. So absolutely, that's the miracle. But I don't want to stop in 48, and I don't even want to stop in 1967. What gives me hope is 2019. Lots of people like to say to me, oh, Israel's become such a disappointment. Ah, there's never been such a rupture between Israel and the diaspora. Ah, Thomas Friedman writes, our grandfathers Israel. Our grandfathers Israel, where in the 1950s, Israeli Arabs were under a military regime. Our grandfathers Israel, when Mizrahim, Sephardim came off the boat and had their identities stripped. Our grandfathers Israel, where we didn't know if we would survive 48 or 56 or 67. Our grandfathers Israel, where if you were an entrepreneur, if you were a capitalist, if you were a Beginite, you got crushed by the Ben Gurion Branja. And yet, we were able to love our grandparents Israel. So, when I look at 2019, I don't see disappointment. I see challenges. But I give what I call the road tests. Are we on the whole going in the right direction? And on most indicators, when I look around at this complicated, wonderful society, I see signs for good. I see the directional signals are positive. When I look at my Israeli Arab friends, and we still have more work to do on that, when I see that 20 years ago, 1 or 2% of Israeli Arabs would be in Israeli universities, and now 20% are in Israeli Arab universities, when I jog up and down the Rakevet Mesilah, Park Mesilah, and I pass people, and I don't know if they're Arab or Jew, but I know we're all worshiping in the Republic of Sport, that's an amazing accomplishment, especially in the crazy Middle East. So I'm not unaware of the moral challenges, I'm not unaware of the dilemmas, but fundamentally when I look at the state of Israel, and I hear people like Yossi Beilin say, nowhere else in the world do I know where secular Jews could pass on their secular identity. And then I look at them and I go, secular. You speak Hebrew fluently. You know to eat cheesecake on Shavuot. You feel maybe a little guilty about eating on Tisha B'Av, or you don't, you know it's there. You will never go out with me on a Friday night at 7 o'clock to the hottest restaurant in Tel Aviv because your mother will kill you because you have to be at Shabbat dinner. I say, you're the worst secular people in the world. You don't know how to be secular. Come to New York, I'll show you secular. So on the whole, I see challenges here, but on the whole, I'm quite optimistic. When I look at the diaspora, I'm a little more concerned. I'm a little more concerned about a community which is 70% intermarrying. I'm a little more concerned in the United States. I'm a little more concerned about a community which now is saying intermarriage isn't a problem but an opportunity. I'm concerned with a community which responds to that with a whole series of old-fashioned guilt trips which won't work. I'm disturbed that the community can't say, no, you know, we're not going to work with the you should not. The thou shalt nots don't work. But can we create a new educational opportunity where we start saying, I could not intermarry because it's an important value statement, an I statement for me to build a Jewish home, to build Jewish continuity. And 2 is better than 1. So I'm not into the whole negation of the diaspora. I'm not into the whole demonization of the diaspora. But I do think, especially when so many of our diaspora friends feel so comfortable coming and finger pointing at all our weaknesses here, we need to have a bit of a mutual conversation which we see some of the challenges there too.
Hello everybody. We've been asked what gives us despair and hope about the diaspora and about Israel, and I've been sitting here trying very hard to think of what gives me hope about the diaspora. I haven't really found much success so far, but perhaps by the time we've finished I will have been inspired. I can tell you what I'm quite despairing about when it comes to the diaspora, and I speak from that small, misbegotten lump of rock that sort of got separated from the mainland of Europe billions of years ago and floated off into the Atlantic and then forgot where it was going. But it does, I have to reliably report to you, still have a Jewish community, which I think is possibly a fraction of the Jewish community of Boston, but nevertheless it's there. And so when I look at them and I look at our cousins across the pond, I have to say that I am really very concerned. In Britain and in Europe, and increasingly in America, there is clearly, we can all see, the, again, rising spectre of overt anti-Jewish attacks, both verbal and physical. And I think that the Jewish communities in Britain and in Europe in particular are likely to find themselves increasingly over the coming years, unfortunately, caught up in the tremendous civilizational struggle that's going on in the West over what the West actually is. And we might talk about that later in the discussion. But I think what most concerns me about the Jews in the diaspora is that the internal divisions between them, which arise out of what I consider to be the progressive loss of a sense of themselves as a people, but the deep, deep, deep desire to assimilate into the surrounding culture, which particularly in America, but also in Britain, is extremely comfortable. And this deep, deep, deep reluctance to identify as a people, which perhaps is more pronounced in Britain than America among the Jewish community. And without a sense of the Jews as a people, you know, the idea of Judaism itself becomes extremely weak and is unlikely to survive. And so I'm more concerned about the internal divisions in the diaspora than I am about the external pressures, grave as they are. When it comes to Israel, how can any of us not be overly concerned about the threat from outside, from Iran? Iran is the single greatest threat to all of us in the free world, and in particular in Israel, for reasons that I'm sure I don't have to go into. And I'm also very concerned about the internal divisions in Israel between Haredi and secular, or as the secular would imagine, everybody who is religious is Haredi. The unresolved dilemma or tension from the start of the State of Israel as to whether Israel is fundamentally the realization of the religious ideal of the return of the Jews to be a holy people in this land, or whether it is a great break from that, a triumphant break from that, into something called the new Jew, who is devoid of or divorced from that religious past, and who owes nothing to it, and who makes him and herself anew and a new nation, which has to be regarded as a nation just like any other. And this tension, which has been there from the start, is unresolved, and we can see it playing out today. And I don't see any sign that it is being, that this great division is being healed. That does concern me. But this concern for me, and I haven't spent much time here until a very short time ago. I didn't come here at all until the year 2000. And now I live here most of the time, and that's another story. But what gives me so much hope here is that this is quintessentially a country of hope. I mean, I never cease to be astounded by the catchphrase here, Hakol yeh beseder. And I think, what, are you mad? Hakol yeh beseder here? But this is how you live here, because you have to live here. Because without that, you know, you can't live. And this is such a place of hope. And it's not just a sentimentalized thing. Look at the birth rate. The birth rate is, to me, the key indicator of whether a country has a future, whether a civilization has a future. In Britain, in Europe, in America, the birth rate of the indigenous people is flatlining or below. They are literally dying out. Why are they dying out? I believe it's because fundamentally they don't have faith in a future for their descendants. Here, the birth rate, not just among Orthodox people, but among secular people, is, what is it, 3 or 4 times? Between 3 and 4%. It's well above replacement rate. This is a country which has faith in its future, and this is a country which is motoring. It has, you know, an economy which is thriving. It has high tech, which is leading the world. all these things suggest that this is a country which believes in itself, and the country which believes in itself is going to survive. But more than that, it is a country which has great pride in itself. It, first of all, has pride in itself as a nation. It understands what it is to be a nation. That is to say, whatever the divisions between us, and they are very severe, and I don't minimize them for a moment, ultimately everyone's marching together with one common purpose, which is to survive as a Jewish people, as a Jewish nation in this homeland of the Jews. And that is in itself an inspiring thing. But beyond that, what this nation is doing is, to me, a realization of what we all are taught that the Jews have to do, which is to be a light unto nations. Because I'm looking at its record in the moral sphere. I'm looking at the army. I'm looking at the armed forces. I know, because I'm in this world when I'm reading this stuff, I know that the rate of, I don't know what the technicality is, the technical language is, but the rate of, the ratio in war of the civilians to fighters who are killed is here, I think it's 1-to-1. And in every other civilized country, America, Britain, their wars, they kill, roughly speaking, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, wherever, they kill roughly 3 civilians to every fighter. In other words, Israel's achievement in protecting civilian life in its wars, which are only ever fought defensively, its record in preserving civilian life is 3 or 4 times greater than any other Western civilized country. That is an astounding thing, an astounding achievement. That's before we get to all the achievements we know about in medicine, in cutting-edge medicine and technology, which are saving lives, in Israel's ability and its willingness to help with international emergencies. It's always the first team there in a disaster. We know all of that. But the really hard stuff, you know, when it comes to it, do you sacrifice your own boy soldier to save a child of the enemy? We do that. Now that to me is such a source of pride that that alone would be to justify us being a light unto nations. So for me, Israel is quintessentially a place of pride, optimism, and hope.
I want to suggest, and this picks up on a thread that you touched upon, Melanie, that we're in a moment of great confusion as a people about how to balance universalism and particularism. This could be illustrated best in terms of, say, American Jewry by 2 different kind of extreme examples that I think underscore, because of their extremity, the confusion. One was the now famous Michael Chabon speech last May, a year plus ago at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, in which he argued for the erasure of all boundaries between Jews and non-Jews, and in fact all boundaries within Jewish life. He described in marriage as a ghetto of 2. He sees rabbinic Judaism as an interlocking system of distinctions and divisions, and the reinforcement, he suggests, of such divisions is a kind of chauvinistic rejection of the other. And on the opposite extreme, we have Jonathan Newman, who wrote a book that was a critique of the American Jewish community's embrace of Tikkun Olam, called To Heal a World. I think I actually heard of the book first from you, Gil. To Heal the World, How the Jewish Left Corrupts Judaism and Endangers Israel. And Newman argues that the truth is, he says, Tikkun Olam has no basis in Judaism. The universalism of Tikkun Olam destroys the boundaries between Jews and others and leads to policies that run counter to the Jewish community's self-interest. These 2 extreme positions, Michael Chabon and Jonathan Newman, suggest that we're really trying to figure out how that balance is supposed to work, about self-interest and the perpetuation of Jewish distinctiveness and our larger responsibilities to the world. So how is this how is the emphasis on one of these to the exclusion of the other a kind of dividing line between diaspora and Israeli Jewry? And how does Jewish nationalism pose a particular dilemma for universalist-oriented diaspora Jews? And how can we help make some sense out of this great confusion that world Jews have, and maybe diaspora Jews in particular, about how we do this balance?
So first, this is not just an issue of 2019. This is an issue since the Enlightenment. This is an issue since we've been actually had an opportunity to be a part of the world. There's an old joke about three traveling salesmen in the 1930s. And they're on a train and they're talking and talking. At a certain point, they turn to religion. And one of them says, "Hi, my name is Charles. I'm a Catholic." And one of them says, "Hi, my name is John. I'm a Protestant." And the third says, "Hi, my name is Bob. I'm a citizen of the world." And they go, "Oh, a Jew." I usually update that story to talk about a modern college dorm where it's Muhammad, a Muslim, and Jane, a Catholic, and again, the Jew. So this has been an aspiration. In fact, one of the tensions that Melanie was talking about in terms of where Israel goes comes from some of the universalism that was packed into Zionism, which of course is one of our exciting contradictions. But it is indeed a major concern in 2019. And it's particularly a concern in the United States of America. Think about it. Think about a typical 15 or 16-year-old. They are told that the most important piece of real estate in their young life is not their home and not their homeland, but it's the university that's going to finally let them in. The pressure these young kids are under, to have the perfect CV, to have the sky-high GPA, and then to write that insane essay about how I, at the age of 17, am a hero and have saved the world, and that's why this university has to accept me. Really, does a number on you. And they come to university, and what are they told? The building blocks that we have used for thousands of years for our identity, religion and nation, feeling a sense of belonging, and feeling a commitment to the world through our sense of belonging, are not just wrong, but evil. And that you can't be a nationalist, and you can't believe in religion, and that's for boobs and the age of Trump. It's for the truly evil people in the world. And nationalism itself has become a dirty word. And when I go around, talk about my new book, The Zionist Ideas, and I talk about how we have to be the torchbearers, this generation. An Israel educator in Chicago comes up to me, 30-something-year-old, but he's committed his life to Israel education, and he says to me, every time you use that word nationalism, and every time you use the word torchbearers, the phrase torchbearers, all I heard was Trump, Charlottesville, and Nuremberg. I can't make this stuff up. That's why I have to leave the house, because you just hear these crazy stories. This is where we're at, because Donald Trump on the far right and the postmodernists on the far left have told us that it's an either or. It's liberalism or nationalism. It's universalism or particularism. And for 3,900 years, we've been juggling. For 2,000 years, we've been juggling. For the 250 years since the Enlightenment, we've been juggling. And we must continue to juggle. And we must continue to teach. Let me take off my kippah. As an American historian, I cannot explain the history of the United States of America or the history of most successful liberal democracies without using that N-word nationalism. What's Ronald Reagan without nationalism? What's Bill Clinton without nationalism? What's Barack Obama without nationalism? Republicans and Democrats. That's the glue. And by the way, Yuli Tamir from the left has written a very interesting book about nationalism, saying, how do we get to cross-class issues? How do we say to a gazillionaire, you know what? Put some of your money aside and accept higher taxes. For what? Just the greater good? Human beings don't do the greater good so well. And they certainly don't pass it on from generation to generation. But having that sense of tribe, having that sense of identity, having that sense of commitment, having that sense of connectedness to one, that's worked. It's the magic of America. It's the magic of Israel. And so I think we need to go back to that magic, and we need to not be apologetic. And the answer to Tikkun Olam is that Tikkun Olam isn't what Mama Troy warned me, which is being so open-minded your brains fall out. Tikkun Olam, people like to call it Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam, that Tikkun Olam is that distortion. Tikkun Olam is being rooted in the Jewish story and using that as your platform to do good. using that as your platform to reach out, using that as your platform to say, I'm a part of this world, and I'm going to be a citizen of the world. And finally, if I may, while I completely agree with Melanie about the pregnancy rate, the cute little statistic, I call it the pregnancy test. And the cute little statistic is that Israel's birth rate is 3.1. The last time England and France had that birth rate was in 1879. I must disagree with you about the diaspora. Because while I have my concerns about the universalism of the diaspora, while I have my concern about intermarriage in the diaspora, come meet every one of these Pardes students and see points of light that come from the diaspora. And come and hear their stories about the institutions that nurtured them, about the families that nurtured them, about the ideas that inspire them, and about how they're really going to be the torchbearers. I'm not just playing to the crowd, but I spend a lot of my time with Birthright. I spend a lot of my time with this generation. And we failed them. We, the grown-ups, have failed them. We haven't given them an exciting, inviting Judaism that really brings things alive. And it's there. You just got to do a better job.
As far as I'm concerned, Judaism is the ultimate in particularism. It is this is why we're always in trouble against universalist ideologies. We always stand in the way of universalist ideologies because our values come from something extremely particular to us, which is our Jewish heritage, our Jewish moral values, and all the rest of it. And liberal universalism is the opposite. Liberal universalism says that distinctions between nations and cultures is inherently divisive and therefore inherently prejudicial, and therefore must be stamped out. And the only way to live is through a universalist approach, which is basically a kind of brotherhood of man ideology, which breaks down national barriers, breaks down borders, both cultural and geographical. And in which laws have to be made, and institutions producing those laws have to be transnational. Now, in my view, one of the tragedies of the great tragedy of American Jewry today is that the 70% or so who subscribe to liberal universalist values have convinced themselves that these are Jewish values, and that is effectively what the book about Tikka and Alam was saying. It's not simply that you have people who are leaving Judaism because they're assimilating, they're disappearing, because they prefer the surrounding culture. They've told themselves that the surrounding culture's values are their Jewish values. And this is beyond distressing. It is really a kind of poison at the heart of a community. Now, nationalism has a very bad PR. To me, nationalism is a rude word for what I would call national identity. And national identity to me is a form of love. It is a form of love of other people who are people with whom you share some things that are of overwhelming importance to you. You share values, you share a language, you share a religion, you share a set of traditions, a set of cultural attitudes and a history, and you are sharing a common project. Does that mean that people outside that particular tradition, that particular nation, don't share? Yes, it does. Does it mean they can never share? No, it doesn't. It means that when they come in, they have to learn to assimilate and to become. And it takes time. It can't be done overnight. Now, if Britain is a nation, if Britain, and this is a very controversial thing at the moment, as you may know, we have this little thing called Brexit going on in Britain. And the idea that people can stand up, just like I've just said, and say Britain is a nation, we should be proud of its national values, that is, oh, you're like Trump. Excuse me? That is nationalism. That is fascism. You're a Nazi. Literally, it goes like that. You stand up for British national identity, you're a Nazi. But if the British, talking of Nazis, if the British had not had an overwhelmingly strong sense of national identity, pride in their country, understanding of the uniqueness of the value of their country, and the need to defend it, Hitler would have won the war, because Britain stood alone on that basis. So don't tell me that national identity is fascism. National identity is the way you defend fascism. It's the way you defend your patch of earth, which you share with others who are in a similar project to you. You defend it against people who want to destroy it. Now, to me, nationalism or national identity is all about sharing and belonging. And universalism sounds so great, doesn't it? The brotherhood of man. But what universalism means in practice is not belonging to anything. Because if you don't belong to something, you belong to nothing. If you are universalist in your values, you basically have no values. What it means is that if you believe that the nation and its laws count for nothing, or count for only stuff that's bad, and only transnational universalist laws and values count for anything, then you find, as we have found and are finding in America, in Britain, in the West, that what was once a nation bounded by a common culture breaks down into tribal warfare between groups, identity groups, cultural groups, all fighting each other for power and privilege, and all fighting to destroy each other. And that's where we've got to. So universalism, far from bringing peace on earth, amity between people, it's breaking down the divisions. It creates divisions. And here's the final thing about Jewish particularism, the final paradox about Jewish particularism. And this drives my secular friends absolutely crazy when I say it. So I will say it. Here, of course, I expect everybody to agree. Jewish particular values, which are reviled as being, the fount of all that's bad in the world. Judaism. What did the Old Testament give to us? It gave to us this vengeful God. It gave to us obscurantism. It gave to us superstitious mumbo jumbo and all the rest of it. Okay. What this Hebrew Bible gave to the world was unique. It gave to the world a belief that the universe was intelligible. It gave to the world the belief that was revolutionary, that there was such a thing as progress, that time was not cyclical, it was linear, but one thing led to another, and that meant you could have progress. It gave the world the revolutionary idea that the world was created by an intelligence. It wasn't random. It was an intelligence behind it. That meant we have natural laws. That is what led to science. The earliest scientists in the West believed that they had been given a God-given gift of reason in order to interrogate the natural laws of the universe given by God. That's what they were doing. Now, in due course, we jumped God and kept the science. But without God, there is no science. Without the Hebrew Bible, there is no rationality. Without the Hebrew Bible, there is no concept of the unique wonderfulness of every human being, and therefore the respect we should give to every human being on earth. In other words, and I could go on in this similar vein, in other words, every single value that is valued and defended and obsessed over by the secular West, love for others, putting others first, our common humanity, respect for life, standing up against the oppressor, defending the vulnerable, being just, doing justly. It's all from the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible gave us these values which are so amazingly important. They've become universalized to a certain extent, but they're not universal. They're based in Judaism. And without the Hebrew Bible, they are nothing. So to my secular friends, I say, you are sawing off the branch on which you are sitting by this culture war you are waging against the culture of the West, which rests on the bedrock of the Hebrew Bible and the Christianity which came from the Hebrew Bible. By fighting this, you are sawing off the branch on which you sit. And the paradox is that Jewish particularism will save the world.
I'm glad I'm not one of their secular friends. It seems to me, Leon, that there is a Jewish answer to your question, and it's older than 200 years. We've been grappling with the particularism universalism divide for all of Jewish history, not just since the Enlightenment. Let's do as Melanie did and go back to the Tanakh. The first 11 chapters of Bereshit do not mention a Jew. They are universal. They introduce a God that is the one God of all of humanity. They introduce the differentiation between good and evil that must apply to all human beings. And they prove to us that human beings have a tremendous struggle dealing with that particular reality. And as a result, God introduces the Jewish people, primarily through Abraham, in chapter 12. And the very first instruction, as you all know, that Abraham gets is, Lech lecha, get out of town. And the reason that he's going to get out of town is not just because he needs to go to this place that will ultimately be the homeland and the springboard for a national message. Perhaps even more importantly, it's to separate himself from the surrounding culture, because so long as he is part and parcel of a culture that is headed in a different direction, it is infernally difficult to try to create something distinctive that will be the beacon it's supposed to be. So when we talk about American Jewry and British, Australian, Canadian, and French, they live, we who live in the diaspora for any length of time, live with a tremendous challenge. How do you remain part of a society and yet not part of a society? How do you behave in a way that puts up sufficient barriers to the impact that a surrounding culture has upon you, such that you can carve out a significant Jewish identity that will stand the test of time and that will ultimately be an articulate critic of the society of which you are a part and not a part? We have been grappling with this particularist, universalist dialectic since the beginning of time. And Judaism has an answer. At the end of days, Yeshayahu teaches us, all the nations of the world will flow unto the mountain of the Lord. The nations in their individuality, the nations in their particularity, not because particularism ultimately defeats universalism, but because particularism ultimately comes along to express the full panoply of human beauty, of human grandeur, through the way in which we carry out our particular national aspirations and our particular national visions. Just as we think it's a good thing that there are multiple cultures and languages and ways to view the world, so nations are important. And the preservation of the Jewish nation and of the Jewish way of seeing reality is perhaps most important, because it has a way of expressing how other nations could perhaps aspire to this balancing dialectic. Christianity and Islam have a universalist approach to the world. Only Judaism has the idea that through one particular nation, universalism might be expressed. And let me say a word about Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam, as it is currently understood in liberal Jewish circles in the West, is nonsense, is Jewishly incoherent. Worse than Jewishly incoherent it actually comes to obscure fundamental Jewish values and expressions. We have ideas. Chesed, Gemilut Chasadim, Tzedakah. If you're going to do one of those, express it in Jewish terminology. I often ask my students what the boundaries of Tikkun Olam are. Can somebody who claims that they are fighting in favor of a woman's right to choose claim that she is actually doing work on behalf of Tikkun Olam? And if you say yes, can somebody who takes the opposite point of view, who is fighting against the woman's right to choose, so-called pro-life, can she also claim that she is doing the work of Tikkun Olam? Can a Jew who moves to Tahiti and wants to work in nutrition for the natives of Tahiti, disconnected from any Jewish enterprise or Jewish thought, claim they are doing Tikkun Olam? Tikkun Olam becomes the narcissistic representation of whatever we subjectively have determined is good and therefore is void, empty of any particular content or reality. Judaism has ideas. Judaism has proud concepts that call upon us to act in certain ways. If you want to do this work Jewishly, and we're all commanded to do this work Jewishly, then scrap Tikkun Olam and use the Jewish concepts that have been handed down to us through the ages.
I have another half a dozen questions that I want to pose to you, but I think we're going to open this up to the audience in a moment. I wonder if very briefly, this is a little dangerous, like a minute and a half for each of you. Just I want to bring it, as you're thinking of your questions, I want to bring it from the broader, more theoretical to something very tachlis oriented, something that I think drove Deborah and the development of this, the theme for today, which is the rise of anti-Semitism. And I think we're going to start with you, Danny, from Pittsburgh. How do we balance in our own assessment of where we are vis-a-vis Jews in the world today, these horrific expressions of anti-Semitism with the incredibly hopeful and inspiring response of non-Jews in the communities where this has happened? So very briefly.
It's impossible to do this very briefly, but let me say the following. Yossi Klein Halevi is fond of saying, not fond of saying, but regularly says that Israel is the most reviled country on the face of the planet. Think about that for a moment. You take all the sum total of revulsion that there is out there for all the revolting nations in the world, Israel comes out on top as being the most reviled nation in the world. We're far from perfect, but we're far from the worst country in the world. Very far. In fact, I endorse everything that Melanie and Gil said earlier in terms of the extraordinary attainments of this place. So one has to say that anti-Semitism is not only alive and well, but in its leftist form and in its right-wing form and its Islamist form, it is developing and moving ahead. We live in an age of globalization, of tremendous changes, of forces that are tearing apart lives and economies and political systems, and people need a scapegoat. And we have served as the historic scapegoat and continue to serve in that way. That all having been said, the equation is dramatically changed by two realities. Reality number one, the existence of the state of Israel and the Jewish power with which I began. And reality number two, we are not alone. We are not a nation that dwells alone where everybody else in the world hates us. We like to paint that picture, but it's not a realistic picture. And just to give you the vignette from Pittsburgh, where I was on October 27th and and spent the subsequent months dealing with the community. And I wept many tears on that day and in the weeks thereafter, but I have to tell you, I wept more tears out of the extraordinary, overwhelming outpouring of support and caring, the unexpected, breathtaking reaction of the non-Jewish community around about us. I wept more tears of gratitude and surprise, frankly, for that than for the losses, horrendous though they were. And I don't think Pittsburgh is the only city in the world where that would happen. It's a phenomenon that is the exception to Jewish history. And I think that we have to bear in mind the reality that we have allies and work to build the connections to those allies even while anti-Semitism continues to prosper around us.
I agree that Zionism failed because Zionism was supposed to solve the problem of anti-Semitism, make it go away. And in fact, anti-Semitism, not just the longest hatred, but the most plastic of hatred, adapted. And now Israel is the Jew among the nations, the Jew in the world. I also believe that Zionism succeeded because we're no longer powerless and we're no longer we can push back. But shifting to the American side of things, I want to say a number of things. One, we have to be very, very careful to put Pittsburgh and the new anti-Semitism we're seeing in context. We have to put it in the context of El Paso. We have to put it in the context not just of this ugly tribalism we're seeing, but also of this annihilation of the self that also comes from universalism, that also comes from pop culture, that also comes from the me, my, more, now world, that makes these individuals so alone, that makes the internet so important, that inflames them, empowers them. Steven Spielberg, the great Jewish historian, sings through the words of Feigl Mauskowitz, "There are no cats in America," as their way of expressing the fact that America is different. And America is different. We also have to say, God bless America. Because I don't think, I'm sorry to say that in Europe there would be the same kind of outpouring. I don't think in Asia or in Africa there would be the same kind of outpouring like for when things like happen, right? So, you know, there's a problem here also. And we have to acknowledge the uniqueness of the United States of America in standing up. We also have to acknowledge that right now, in the 21st century, there is a new legitimacy for anti-Semitism on the left and on the right. And I want to call on the Jewish community to do two things. One, remember the teaching of Rabbi Hartman. Rabbi Hartman said that if we just define our identity on Auschwitz and not on Sinai, it's a form of moral narcissism. If we go and only use Pittsburgh to build a Zionist identity, we fail. I want to build a Zionist identity for positive reasons, not as the negative, oppressed Galut Jew. But secondly, I need my friends from the left to call out left-wing anti-Semitism. I need my friends from the right to call out right-wing anti-Semitism. And I need us all as Jews, think of how bad it is that we can't even agree on the enemy. Natan Sharansky taught us about the 3 Ds, demonization, double standards, and delegitimization. We also need to add what I call the 4 H's. If there's an attack on the Holocaust or a use of the Holocaust against us, that too is anti-Semitism. If there's an attack on halakha, kashrut laws, circumcision laws, that too is anti-Semitism. If there are attacks claiming that Jews have hegemony, are controlling the world, that too is anti-Semitism. And if any one of those old historic libels, the rich Jew, the influential Jew, the super powerful Jew, the ugly Jew, the big-nosed Jews are being used against us, that too is anti-Semitism. And those 4 H's tend to be the ticks of the right, and the 3 Ds tend to be the ticks of the left. And we need to work together. And we cannot use anti-Semitism as a point of discord in the community, but as a point where we work together. And we say, I'm going to call out my own, because there's a deeper issue here, which is the fight against bigotry and hatred.
One of the reasons why anti-Semitism has erupted in the way that it has in the West is because of the fact that anti-Zionism is not recognized as a form of anti-Semitism. There is this iron determination to say anti-Semitism is like Hitler, it's like jackboots, it's against Jews as people, I love Jews as people, I just hate Israel. I'm not an anti-Semite. In my view, this is a completely false distinction, that anti-Zionism is in fact a form of anti-Semitism. It is the new, it is the latest mutation of anti-Semitism. Now, the question is therefore why, at this point in history, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism have erupted in this way. Why people can't reconcile themselves to Jewish existence, whether as individuals or as a people. There are many complicated reasons for this, and we could discuss this all day and all week. But in short, I believe that anti-Semitism is at its worst and most lethal when a culture is in trouble. When a culture is reasonably healthy, it's anti-Semitism never ever goes away, but it's kept underground. It's regarded as completely beyond the pale. When a culture is in trouble, when it forgets what it is, when it starts fighting among itself, then the Jews really always get it in the neck. That's when anti-Semitism is at its most lethal. And that is what we're living through now. We're living through a situation, in my view, where the West is a culture in deep trouble. And by trouble, I don't mean it's going down. I mean that there is now we can see in Britain, in Europe, in America, there is a tremendous struggle, which may just be starting, a tremendous struggle over what the West actually is, whether it is a thing at all, if it is a thing, what it is, whether we should have pride in it, whether we should destroy it. And there are people who want to know what it is, who know what it's rooted in. They know that it's rooted in biblical morality, and they want to defend it, and they want to defend the nations that give it expression, against those who want to dissolve all of that into a kind of universalist utopia. That struggle is underway, and who knows how it will end. But it is my view, very clearly, a struggle at root against the West is a struggle at root against the Hebrew Bible. And in my view, the West will not rescue itself until it learns to love the Jewish people, until it learns to love Israel, and until it learns to understand, until it begins to understand that the values that it depends on, all of it, are effectively, in effect, values rooted in the Hebrew Bible, to which end we as Jews have, I think, a responsibility, which, to put it mildly, we do not accept at all at the moment, which is not just to fight anti-Semitism, not just to fight the lies about Israel, but to teach the world what Judaism actually is, including teaching the Jews.
Thank you for that. We're going to do something very challenging now in our remaining 12 minutes. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience, and I'm going to ask our very thoughtful and articulate panelists to address one of those that you feel you'd like to address. We'll see how we're doing. We're probably going to have about 3 minutes, 4 minutes for each of you. So, well, let's take a few questions, please.
I've been living here for the last 22 years, and one of the things I thought...
Let me pass the mic.
We talk about particularism versus universalism. I'm experiencing, as a person living here for 23 years, that within the Jewish community, within the Jewish people here, that in fact there's a danger of particularism within ourselves. What I mean by that is the sectoralization and the division among different peoples of different Jewish people who feel that they have the truth. They have their particularism is expressed in their seemingly truth, the way they see it as what Judaism is. So when we talk about particularism, I'd like you guys to address it in a different way, seen through the unity of our Jewish, not us versus the non-Jewish.
A number of years ago, Samuel Huntington came up with the concept of the class of civilizations. Barack Obama, as president, made a speech in Cairo, in effect, saying that we're just poo-pooing that, and he got a Nobel Peace Prize for it. What do you think of the concept of the class of civilizations? Is it a realistic one? And B, if it is, what role do you see Israel playing?
Maybe we'll take one last short question.
Behind you. Let's go ahead.
Particularly Melanie Phillips, there are moderate Muslims, but is there a moderate Islam?
Again, just for the sake of time, I don't think each of you will have an opportunity to address all three of those questions, but feel free to address any of those that.
Okay. Is there are maybe moderate Muslims, but is there a moderate Islam? There are certainly moderate Muslims, although there are some Muslims who claim to be moderate who are not moderate, so it's a very confusing picture, but there are moderate Muslims. There are very brave moderate. There are some very brave Muslims who wish to have the equivalent in Islam of what Christianity had in the Reformation. In other words, they want a Reformation according to the values that they believe are civilized within Islam. I don't know whether that's possible or not. I'm not an Islamic scholar, but I do know from what is perceivable from history that throughout history there have been elements throughout history there have been elements in Islam which have been pacific and moderate and enlightened, and they have unfortunately been stamped on by the more powerful fanatical and expansionist forms of Islam. And that's been the history of Islam. And so whether there can be a moderate Islam, I don't know. I just think that we all have a duty, all of us, to stand up behind those exceptionally brave Muslims who are trying to reform their religion and support them in the way that we used to do in the Soviet Union when you had dissidents and refuseniks. The only way those people kept going was because of the support of the West and others who were supporting them. In Islam, it's even worse because a word out of place and you are killed. So they need our support, and certainly without support they can get nowhere. Whether they can get anywhere, I don't know. But for heaven's sake, it must be worth trying.
I'm well aware of the dangers of particularism in Israel. I don't want to get too political, but I'm certainly appalled by heroes of mine like Yuli Edelstein, by intelligent politicians like Ayelet Shaked and Naftali Bennett and Nir Barkat, who weren't able to call out the Bibi Netanyahu's attempt to bring in Kahanists into the mainstream. And I think that's a reflection of a major issue in Israeli society. But I want to advise you, and it actually connects to the Clash of Civilizations, because one of the exciting things about being here, and one of the terrifying things about being here, is we're having our own mini Clash of Civilizations right here. But I want to advise that rather than just spending your whole time reading the headlines and reading the newspapers, open up Shmuel Rosner's new book. And notice how there's this new thing, this new phenomenon where 55 to 65% of Israelis are, as I was suggesting earlier, both proud to be Israeli and also having Shabbat dinner. And they're crossing the wires. I love intermarriage in Israel because we're having Mizrahim and Ashkenazim intermarrying, and one of the things we're seeing is that false thing of the secular Israeli who will eat pork on Yom Kippur is disappearing. And that mixing that's occurring right here, right now, look at almost any Israeli simcha, and you see kippur and no kippur. You see Haredim. Every Haredi I know, if you ask them, says, oh, are people leaving the Haredi community? Of course not. But you go to any one of their family smachot, and you see Chilanim and Datim living together. And so that's the thing. We have to remember not to be swept up by the headlines and to see the realities. And we also need some leadership. We need leadership which pulls us together. We need leadership which sings a song of enlightenment and of inspiration and of national pride, and shows, as I think all three of us has been suggesting, it's a false choice to say universalism or particularism. It's a false choice to say or national pride or good values. But we need people to synthesize it from the top and from the bottom.
It was the Quran that designated us the people of the book, not Jewish tradition. In Jewish tradition, if we were to really describe ourselves, we are the people of the argument. Nothing gets Jews going more than a good argument. What is the Talmud? not a whole series of good arguments. And therefore, we love to argue with each other, and Israel is internally a hotbed of argumentation. But as I teach that we actually, as Jews, agree on 85% of the stuff we teach and espouse and stand for. It's just that we're much more focused on the 15% because that's much more fun, because then we can have a good argument. But if we would only look at the 85% of where we have overlap, not just overlap, congruence, we would find that there is a lot more uniformity and thereby strength that goes beyond the apparent tribalism that seems to be there on the surface. Clash of civilizations. Nobody today mentioned China and India. So let's talk about China and India for a moment. This is, by most people's guess, the Chinese century. And we haven't even begun to see the rise of Chinese power and what that will do in terms of the civilization mix in the world. I think the clash of civilization terminology is dated. It goes back to a time when the world had two poles around which it revolved. The clash of civilizations now is a much more complicated reality. And when we talk about the fact that in Asia there aren't that many people who love us, it's also true that in Asia there isn't that great widespread anti-Semitism either. After all, let's look at the reality. China and India are happy to deal with us despite the conflict. They're not so interested in these sort of issues. So we are heading into a time of globalization where the potential impact of Jewish ideas on civilization broadly is immense, precisely because of the regaining of Jewish power. And we shouldn't see the world in bipolar terms, but in terms of a great opportunity to bring the message of the Jewish core principles to a much larger audience.
I want to thank our incredibly thoughtful and articulate panelists, Danny Schiff, Bill Troy, and Martin Phillips. Thank you all for being with us today. The program of learning continues shortly.